Thank you. I'm standing in for someone else, so bear with me. Our topic tonight is going to be on the Indigenous, Assyrian, and Native American experience, from attempted eradication to preservation of cultural revitalization. And we have 4 panelists tonight. I'm excited to introduce them all to you. We'll start with Dr. Sargon Danabo from Roger Williams University. Sargon Danabo is a teacher, a writer, and holds a PhD in Near Middle Eastern Civilizations from the University of Toronto and a MSCI degree in Anthropology, Animal Studies from Canisius University. Currently, he is a professor of history at Roger Williams University, and his focus consists of indigenous and marginalized communities, as well as cultural continuity, storytelling, wonder, and re-enchantment. He was honored as the 30th Sabah lecturer at the University of Arizona in 2023. Sargon is the creator and editor for the book series Alternative Histories, Narratives from the Middle East and Mediterranean. He is a founding director of the Assyrian Studies Association. Danabo is also published in a variety of journals, from Folklore to National Identities and International Journal of Middle East Studies, and is the author of Reforging or Forgetting History, Iraq and Assyrians of the 20th Century. He is also a writer of science fiction fantasy. And he will be our moderator for tonight's session. Our next panel speaker is Miriam Georges, Simon Fraser University. Miriam Georges is an associate professor of global and indigeneity in the Department of Gender, Sexuality, and Women's Studies at Simon Fraser University. She is Assyrian, indigenous of present-day Iraq, and currently living on the sustained by unceded traditional territories of the Coast Salish people, including the forgive me, how do you say that? Salvatu, yes. Beautiful, thank you. And Musqueam Nation, grounded in embodied decolonial feminist epistemologies. Her scholarship is located at the nexus of global politics, critical indigenous studies, and Middle Eastern studies. Her research interests include issues of global security, global colonizations, indigenities, and decolonization of the politics of Southwest Asia. Our next panelist is Esther Elia, an artist. Esther Elia is from Turlock, California, my hometown. She received a BFA in illustration from California College of Arts and Masters in Fine Arts in Painting, Drawing from the University of New Mexico. Her art practice focuses on the Assyrian experience of diaspora and uses painting and sculpture to explore themes of creating homeland and culture as currently stateless nation. She uses storytelling as a tool for decolonization and community healing, and collects contemporary Assyrian histories as a solve to Western institutional canon and its hyper-focus of Assyrians solely within their ancient contexts. Her work has been displayed in the De Young Museum, San Francisco Arts Commission galleries, Facebook offices, Reconstructed Mag, how do you say that? Guggenheimen, Summer College, Workshop website, and Assyrian region of Iraq, Nala. And we also have, we're happy to introduce Clarence Cruz Thomas. Clarence Cruz. Artist. Clarence Cruz is Tewa from Ohkay Owingeh. Excuse me, I don't want to mispronounce it, would you? Thank you. San Juan Pueblo, and graduated from the University of New Mexico with a BFA and MFA in art studio and minor in museum studies through an internship at Maxwell Museum of Anthropology. Through his contribution in the arts of traditional Pueblo pottery, he was honored with the Lifetime Achievement ALLAN Hauser Legacy Award in 2012, honoring Pueblo potters. SWAIA Santa Fe Indian Market. He has had the opportunity to travel to China to be part of a faculty expedition in Jindenzen Ceramic Institute and hired as consultant curator for the inaugural exhibition for the Alfonso Ortiz Center, Maxwell Museum of Anthropology, University of New Mexico. As a potter and instructor, he works with raw material that he gathers from different sites of Pueblo lands. These materials consist of clays, slips materials, pigments, volcanic ash, and Rocky Mountain bee weed used for plant or as a binder. His pottery fringes are outside furrings. His pottery furrings are outside furrings, which are reduction furrings, oxidation firing, and open firing, fire clouds, that's open firing. Through his continued education, he instructs classes in Pueblo pottery at the graduate and undergraduate levels at the University of New Mexico. His expertise and knowledge are also shared at Santa Fe Community College in the Art and Design Department, Northern New Mexico College, Española, and with Native communities. Thank you. Glad you're here. And now we'll give it over to Dr. Danabo here, our moderator. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sophia. Thank you to the to Genocide Awareness Week, to the Arizona State University. Tim and Volker, thank you so much for all the work, and everyone, and SAFO Center, and everyone who's behind all the scenes, who put everything together. So I guess I'm your moderator for the panel. I don't guess, I knew that, but I apologize, bear with me for a second. I'm going to, so I'm gonna set things up just a little bit. All of us have, in many ways, or three of us, one, two, and then vastly different discipline, different discipline. So we're putting together a very, I think, interdisciplinary discussion here for you all. And we're bridging, I think, a few gaps. Hopefully we're bridging a few gaps for both for ourselves, but also for the communities that we are working on, and for the audience as well. So, and also to the ancestors past, present, and future, and for the land that we are on today, and for all the peoples of the land that we are on today. I wanted to just give thanks for all of that. So thank you very much for having us here with all of you. So my first discussion, I'm gonna try to set things up a little bit and talk a little bit about some of my work, which has most recently dealt with the Assyrians. Can I walk? I can walk around, right? And the Assyrians and the issue of denial of existence. A lot of times when we talk about, and I've worked a significant amount on the Assyrian genocide in 1915, but also Samael in 1933. And working on the Assyrians in modern context, I've started to notice a lot of stuff, a lot of rhetoric that was being used in many ways. And if you look at Stanton's definition of the 10 stages of genocide, one of the things you always hear about is denial, right? Denial is always the last piece, but I started to recognize that denial was in many ways omnipresent in much of the work that I was doing. And I'll try to go through some of it today. So still work in progress, so bear with me a little bit. But the idea is denial of existence, epistemic violence against Assyrians as genocide. So I'm just going to go through some of this today, but who are the Assyrians? Where are the Assyrians? Bias and epistemic violence. And then I'm not going to get into solutions or where we stand today. I'm actually going to pass that off to my fellow panelists because I think they have far better solutions from what I've come up with thus far. So when we talk about the Assyrians, who are they? I'm defining this not because I think there's always a need to, but academically, there seemingly always is a need to. Specifically, I find that in my work on Assyrians. A lot of times when working on majority groups, I notice you don't have to do that, but seemingly for the Assyrians, I was always asked, well, what do you mean by Assyrian? Define that. So for the audience as well who don't know who the Assyrians are, geographically, Assyrians are a transnational population, indigenous to northern Mesopotamia, effectively ancient Assyria and its environs, part of today's northern Iraq, southeastern Turkey, northwestern Iran, northeastern Syria. They speak Assyrian, sometimes referred to as modern form of Mesopotamian Aramaic or Assyrian Aramaic. Sometimes people call it Neo-Aramaic or Neo-Syriac. With a heavy Akkadian influence, so that ancient cuneiform writing that some of you may be familiar with, as well as utilize what's sometimes called classical Syriac in their ecclesiastical edifices, so typically in churches, as many Assyrians today follow a Christian religious tradition. Not all Assyrians are Christian, but a good large percentage of them are, and most belong to some of these churches that are listed here: Chaldean Catholic, Assyrian Church of the East, Syrian Orthodox, Syrian Catholic, and others. And these are sort of the core ones from within the region, and many have sort of branched out from there as well. There is in recent years, in the same way that there is an Armenian community that is typically called crypto-Armenian in places like in Turkey, that's a largely Muslim community, but identify with their Armenian roots. So too are those communities similar for Assyrians. There are crypto-Assyrian communities that exist as well. And in the past 2 millennia, Assyrians have mostly been known by these ecclesiastical designations. And we can talk more about how that's kind of part of polarization that exists as well within the community. And in most cases, they've been increasingly Balkanized based on these identities. This is kind of the territory that we're talking about. So when I talk about the Assyrians, I talk about this territory. Now, of course, this territory is, you can see the Mediterranean Sea on the left. This is, again, that area of northern Iraq, southeast Turkey, northwest Syria, and northeastern Iran. Most of these areas this is actually the map that was put together by the delegation, what was called the Assyro-Chaldean designation to the League of Nations. So they put this map together. It's 1919. And they were basically trying to show as many of the regions that had Assyrian populations as possible. So this is the distribution, and you'll notice it's obviously very transnational today, right? So when I work on the Assyrians, one of the things that I had noticed was I was constantly asked to define them. Who are the Assyrians? What do you mean by Assyrian? In our modern discussions, right, we think of things from a nation state perspective, and everyone will say, that's not true. No, I don't. Yeah, we all do. There's a nation state where we have a passport. People say, where are you from? You have a nation identity, right, behind it. So typically that's one of the first things we think about. And what I started to realize was, well, at least for my academic work, I was constantly being asked to identify the Assyrians and who they are. And there were all these different names that were being used for them. But I said, okay, well, in English, since I'm writing in English, what's the name that's used by them themselves? So what is the emic tradition that they have utilized in English as early as I can find it? So I just brought just for fun, some census documents showing what the Assyrians were identifying as in the United States, because I also do a lot of diaspora history, in the 1920s and 1930s. So what I thought was, okay, let's see what they were looking at. I don't have any idea which one of these is the middle one, the one that's going to show the laser.
Oh,
Or is there a laser beam here? Oh yeah, sweet. Thank you. I didn't want to burn through the piece here, but so if you'll notice, there are various names here, and around the 1920s and then 1930 census, we start to see actually questions of people saying or wondering whether someone has a national tongue, a mother tongue. That will ask the question where the mother is from, where the father is from, and things like that. So you can see various people and their identifications in the middle there. It's a little tough to see, but right here in the middle, this is kind of tough. I have to actually look closely. But here in the middle, you'll see a whole bunch of I don't know if you can see the family here, but there are a couple of different families that have listed here Diyarbakir and Assyrian as their identity. So these were people from Diyarbakir in Turkey, and their identity was Assyrian. Here's another example of that. If you look at the top here, these are ones that are more typically known in the Assyrian community. Most of the Assyrians from the region of what is sometimes referred to as Persia, which is Iran today, and what they identified as. And a lot of times, the term that was used was they were from Persia. So you can see the Persia there, Persia. These are all Assyrians. These are people that see language spoken at home here, mother tongue. You can actually see Assyrian listed there. So all these different names were constantly popping up, and the Assyrians were sort of falling in between all these gaps. But you'll notice, I don't know if you can see this, but way up the top here, you see where it says Assyrian mother tongue? You see what it says at the top above Assyrian? It was actually crossed out by the census taker, and up top was written Syrian. Here's another example. This is the Hoyen family. This is the whole family. Francis, Lizzie, Margaret, Mary, Nimrud, and Emmanuel. This is really interesting. Region of birth, they wrote Assyria, country. These were people from Southeast Turkey, from the region of Harput. Assyria, and then, because this is what they told the census taker, and then the rest were born in Massachusetts, where the father was from. They all wrote Assyria. Mother was from Assyria. Language spoken at home, Assyrian, okay? Notice in every single one of these, what was crossed out? The A and the S. So what does that tell us? Well, it tells us partially that they were identifying as Assyrian, but the census takers didn't like that. They felt that that wasn't accurate, and so they crossed it out and put Syrian, or crossed out the A and the S. These are more examples of that, which I'm not going to bore you with. But one of the things I started saying was, well, so the emic term in English that they always used for their self-identity was Assyrian, at least in the context of English as far back as we know. This was the early community. So if we typically, in today's day and age, we always ask people what their identity is, and we're very accommodating, right? I mean, we think ourselves as enlightened human beings these days, and we like to think of ourselves as accepting. And one of the things I noticed in academia was they weren't looking at this. They weren't looking at this. This is Assyrian written in Armenian. This is Assyrian written in the Assyrian script and in English, and they use the same term Assyrian in English. But the Assyrians were constantly being asked to, this is one of the earliest organizations, Assyrian Benefit Association. This is 1897. So almost as early as you're going to get with civic institutions, they called themselves Assyrian. So, okay, the emic term was Assyrian, sons of Assyrian. I thought, okay, this is very, very interesting. Well, so what does this have to do with epistemic violence? Naming. Well, epistemic violence, that is violence exerted against or through knowledge, right? Epistemology, college students always talk about epistemology and ontology. It's probably one of the key elements in a process of domination, not only through the construction of exploitative economic links or the control of political military apparatuses that dominion is accomplished, but also, and I would argue, and this is from Alvarez's work, most importantly, through the construction of epistemic frameworks that legitimize and enshrine those practices of domination, right? So the creation of institutions and practices of those institutions that say, eventually you'll see this, well, when we talk about Assyrians, what we really mean is we don't use that term because that's not the right term for these people. It's typically from an external perspective, putting it on the Assyrians and explaining who they were. Some of you may be familiar with Vine Deloria Jr., religious studies scholar, has this wonderful piece here in quote saying, Western civilization, unfortunately, typically does not link knowledge with morality, but rather it connects knowledge and power and makes them equivalent. Today, with an information superhighway looming on the horizon, we're told that a lack of access to information will doom people to a life of meaningless and poverty. We look around to observe modern industrial society, although there's no question that information in of itself is useless, and that as more data is generated, ethical and moral decisions and taking on a fantasy dimension, which in this case, he says lack of evidence to indict is the moral equivalent of the good deed. So it's interesting because I came across this quote and I thought to myself, typically we're the type of society that says, okay, innocent until proven guilty, right? Let's go with that sort of thread of thinking. But what I started to notice was that wasn't the case with Assyrians when they were naming themselves. This is who we are. People were saying, no, you're not. Let me explain that. So it was a constant thing. Oh, here we go. well, you see this reflected in Middle East studies as well. And people called the entire field out. Edward Said, right, author of Orientalism, talks about how institutions, vocabulary, scholarship, images, bureaucracies, basically all of this is Orientalizing. It looks at other people differently. It says, we know who they are and what they are, and who are they and what are they? Well, they are what we say they are. Not what they say they are, but we otherize them in a particular way that makes sense to us. And this was a constant thread in what I was reading about the Assyrians, right? Knowledge doesn't need application to reality. It doesn't matter what the Assyrians say, we know the truth, right? So you see this over and over in scholarship, but this piece for Said really hit home with me because it said this idea that ideas are propagated and disseminated anonymously sometimes. They're repeated without attribution. They have literally become a received idea, right? Whatever someone says, you just simply accept it and pass it on, right? It's repeated, echoed, and re-echoed uncritically. I'll give you a great example. So 1992, I was a young college, well, no, wasn't a young college student in 1992, it was before I was a young college student, but I was reading this as a young college student, and the Church of the Eastern Church of England, there's a great comment by a religious studies scholar slash, I guess, philologist, J.F. Coakley, who says, here I refer to the link between modern, and of course, quotes, think about symbolism in genocide as well, quotes, these are also called scare quotes, you guys have heard the term scare quotes, the anti-lambda, when you put somebody's name in quotes, it's you questioning who they are. Has anyone ever heard that before? So the Assyrians and the ancient Assyrians of Nineveh, known to readers of the Old Testament. In modern times, Syrian children have been named Sargon, Nebuchadnezzar, the winged lions of Nineveh have appeared as national symbols. And in short, the name is inseparable from a bogus ethnology. On the right, this is a book that came out in 2017, different author. Go to the middle where it's bold. Syriac children are named Sennacherib, Sargon, Nebuchadnezzar. The winged lions of Nineveh applied proudly on the Assyrian Christian flag. It's not to a T, but it's fairly close. I mean, it's almost exactly taken from that. You'd have to really be on a strange connection to have that exact thought going through your head. So the fact that things started to be echoed uncritically was very, very, very similar. So I said, there's more to this. So I went back a little bit further. Some of you may be familiar with Linda Tuhei Smith, Maori author who wrote Decolonizing Methodologies. Well, I'd been reading a lot of her work, and I realized that this type of academic work was going on, especially about Indigenous peoples, for quite some time. And in her text here, I'm not going to read all of it, but the Maori people, actually, there was a scientific study done in the late 1800s that they took the skulls of their ancestors and they filled it with millet seeds to see the cranial capacity, right? And this was absolutely accepted science at the time. How large their brains were, talked about their cranial capacity. And they talked about their faculties. What were their faculties like? They used these types of terms, faculties, because it was very easy to dehumanize someone who didn't have the same intellectual capacities as someone else, right? This is the whole idea of dehumanization. So I started running through a whole bunch of Western missionary documents on Assyrians, started finding things like this, basically that it set them to thinking. It woke up faculties previously dormant. And what the missionary was talking about in this case were the local Assyrian populations who apparently weren't using their full ability to think until the missionaries came in. And we see this continuously. And we see it in academia with field jumping and term setting as well. Terms like hogwash at the top. My immediate response to claims of continuity. Assyrians say we're Assyrian and we've been around for centuries. That's hogwash in an academic discussion. Western missionaries brought this in, again, that the indigenous Christians were an ancient race was actually given to them by outsiders. That thing wasn't a thing that they had thought about, but rather was offered to them because remember, their faculties were dormant. Syriac Christians, another term that started to be used by Westerners, was equated by European travelers, missionaries, and diplomats with the lost tribes of Israel, the last of the ancient Assyrians, and a whole bunch of other things. There were all sorts of names and identities created for these people from their connection with missionaries and activities from the West. So this was a common thread. I won't go into this one too much, but this is another scholar, not in the world of Assyrians, actually a scholar of Arabic and Islam, talking about what the term Assyrian is. You notice Assyrian, again, in quotes, right? Questioning the term. I'm going to skip this one and do this. It actually pops up in genocide studies. So imagine genocide studies. A bunch of people are, in a very simplistic way, I'm going to say this, people mass killing. Okay, think of a mass killing. We're talking about a genocide. We're talking about Assyrians in genocide studies. This particular phrase, 1999, is in an article. First, however, a few more words about the people themselves, including an apology, given that the term Assyrian is just plain wrong, owing everything to 19th century Western Orientalism and nothing to the community it purports to describe. You remember the emic discussion that I said and showed you the census thing. The correct appellation, this is a non-quote Assyrian telling us this, is the one the people in question themselves traditionally use, right? The endonym, the emic term, SWAIA, which this person translates as Syrians. Now, this is a genocide scholar who's become a philologist as well in the meantime. So what does this all mean? Well, again, I'm going to go back to Linda Smith because she was so influential in the work that I've done. Writing or literacy in a very traditional sense of the word has been used to determine the breaks in between past, present, and the beginning of history and the development of theory. Writing has been viewed as the mark of a superior civilization, and other societies have been judged by this view to be incapable of thinking critically and objectively. And I'm going to use this as one of my last examples. This is from an article that I just wrote, and it was an actual experience of mine, having been asked to be on a panel in the midst of ISIS taking over portions of Syria and Iraq in 2015. So on February 23rd, 2015, in the midst of about a whole bunch of Assyrians being captured, 253 Assyrians from 35 villages along the Khabur in Syria were kidnapped by the Islamic State. They destroyed homes, destroyed villages. By the way, most of those villages in Syria have not been reclaimed. Most Assyrians have left to this day. In response to this, I was asked to talk 2015 on a panel called Ancient Christian Communities and Current Events. They still wouldn't call them Assyrians, Ancient Christian Communities. It was organized by the Center for Middle East Studies at Harvard University. So we all know Harvard University. 4 scholars on the panel. We discussed the particular issues at hand. At one point, one scholar holds up this book by Adam Becker, The Revival and Awakening, and said, oh, it's very interesting, right? Local Harvard scholar, commented on how profound Western missionary influence to these Christians was and how it helped them construct their identity. I remember I was there. A few other people I know were there. A little bit of uneasiness broke out in the crowd. People said, hey, excuse me, what do you mean by that? And he said, oh, no, what I meant was, it's so fascinating how these missionaries gave these Easterners, especially these Assyrians, critical thinking. So I started thinking about this, and this is still a work in progress, but I started to notice there was all these connections here with Stanton's, and I'm just going to use these just for kind of a little bit for as a minor scaffolding at the beginning. But these questions of genocide, these pieces of genocide start with classification and they end with denial. And I started realizing that this was actually a pattern that I was seeing epistemically in terminologies. When you ask the classification, well, who are the Assyrians? You use different terms for them. Who are they? Use everything but Assyrian. It does violence to them. Does that violence to the name? Symbolization, using of scare quotes, right? Putting something in quotations. What do you mean by Assyrian? And then forcing people to define that. Discrimination, and this is a little bit different, but it's connected in a sense that, well, if you can't be Assyrian in the academic discourse, also they're not even recognized as a people in any Middle Eastern state. So there's a connection there. Dehumanization, right? Dormant faculties. It's a very typical commentary. Organization, denial of the term Assyrian in academic texts. There's still gatekeepers of knowledge that exist, right? So you write a text on Assyrians, you write Assyrian, typically the reviewer will say something like, you may want to rethink the term you used for the Assyrians. Write Middle East Christians or something, or Iraqi Christians or something like that. Polarization, preparation, persecution, extermination, all of these pieces are there. And denial was the big one. And what I started to recognize was that all of this actually, in the epistemic discussion, epistemic violence, hinges on the issue of denial. And rather than stages, I started thinking that these could be argued as types of outcomes of epistemic violence. And we start wondering about, well, then what is the question or the intent of doing that? Why does someone feel the need to deny Assyrians not just their genocide, not just the actual killing of Assyrians, but even in that 1999 article to say, I'm sorry for using the term Assyrian, which is wrong? Right after that, towards the article is set up so that at the end, the discussion actually comes full circle and says, well, it seems because of these Protestant missionaries and the connection to the idea of being Assyrian, they were massacred. It was almost blaming the massacre itself, the killing, the physical killing, on their identity as Assyrians. Well, they chose this term incorrectly, and kind of that became a problem. It's very, very fascinating. So as I said, still a work in progress, but I'm just going to say, Todi, thank you. And I'm going to pass it on to Mariam. As I said, this will get much better as we move on, but I wanted to set the stage a little bit, the heavy stuff out of the way first, and then pass on to the next person. Thank you.
I'm already going to be less exciting because I'm going to stay seated if you don't mind, unless you can't see me, in which case I will get up for you if you like. But stay seated. Okay. All right. So now we'll move on to global state making through genocide, connecting global enduring indigeneities. So first, I want to start off by echoing Sargun and saying thank you so much for all the organizers of this really great conference and the SAPO Center and Dr. Ramina for inviting me to speak today alongside these truly esteemed colleagues. In having a conversation about genocide, I want to first acknowledge a couple of things at the beginning of my remarks today. The first is that colonialism and the colonial condition are by their very nature fragmentary. So they divide those of us who once lived together, and they bring together those of us who never lived together before. This process is violent. It rips us apart from our families and friends and relations as it puts up walls and borders that become more solid over time. It is also why we find ourselves all of a sudden having to live with, and usually under, for Indigenous nations, the domination of our oppressors, so experiencing a real loss of our sovereignty. And in this colonial zero-sum game where in order for one to succeed, there has to be a loser, one winner, one loser. So we forget. In the process of remembering across generations this violence that was inflicted on us and that we resisted either by moving or fighting or assimilating, because we are never just passive recipients of colonial violence. In this process of remembering across generations so that we keep our heritage alive and our ancestors with us, because this remembering is so integral to our survival, we sometimes forget that we are not the only ones. We sometimes forget that oppressing another in our bid for survival is not liberatory, but maintains and perpetuates the colonial structures that oppress us in the first place. So in my attempts at trying to piece together my family histories of genocide, displacement and replacement, dislocation and relocation, resistance and survival, I learned something monumentally important to me. When we trace out the histories of colonialism globally and the making of the modern world into nation states, we can trace out how these histories are interconnected. And that has allowed me to look at a much larger and global history of both colonialism and nation making and the interrelated experiences of Indigenous nations all over the world. So if I'm interested in the Assyrian struggle for self-determination and liberation, I need to understand that as a collective struggle, and that demands a solidarity with other such struggles globally, but especially where I am, located on the stolen lands of the West Coast Salish peoples, otherwise known as British Columbia and now called Canada. And in that spirit, I come to the second thing I want to start my talk with here, and having a conversation about Assyrian genocides, the ongoing colonization and occupation of the Assyrian homeland in the making of modern states. And that includes the ongoing project for Kurdish self-determination and statehood in both Iraq and Syria. I want to begin by acknowledging that we are today meeting in a settler colonial state. Yes, America is a settler colonial state built on the ongoing genocide of and on the stolen lands of Indigenous nations here, specifically the territories of the Thana Otham, the Akimel Otham, Upper Pima, and the Hohokam. Genocides are not complete, and so it is an act of resistance to know whose lands we are uninvited guests on, the history of these lands and its peoples, but also these peoples as contemporary stewards and knowers of this place. This is how you begin building relations across territories to be in conversation with Indigenous nations all over the world, but most especially on the land you call home today. A land acknowledgement, it's not just some cool thing you say at the beginning of a talk, but it is a responsibility to act and to get involved in decolonization struggles where we live. And I invite you to do the same when you leave here today. Okay, so I think you can tell from my start here that my research focuses on, but just to make it more concrete, I'm trained as a political scientist. My areas are global politics and politics of the global South. My lived experiences as a granddaughter of genocide survivors, as a child myself dislocated by violence and wars and relocated to make a life on the stolen lands of Indigenous nations and now called Canada. All of these helped shape my commitment to centering indigeneity, race, gender, class in the way I look at the global system, violence, colonialism, and decolonization, and the making of states. Okay, so the question that has animated most of my research has been, how can we think about and understand the ways peoples have been dispossessed and displaced in very different yet interconnected ways across the structural formations of colonialism and its mass genocides and attempted erasures of Indigenous peoples, the kidnapping and enslavement of Africans, and contemporary formations of capitalism based on extraction, which for many results in their forced migration across geographies. So when we think about and understand colonialism as global, we can think about how colonial imperial strategies move across geographies and how interconnected colonial and capitalist systems work across the globe. Thinking about how colonialism has occurred across geographies, time, and histories doesn't mean we ignore the different systems of colonialism and their differences in terms of histories and racial formations. This last part is especially important in understanding the Assyrian context. So much of Indigenous and colonial studies or decolonization studies has focused on what colonialism has looked like here in the Americas, Australia, New Zealand, and so on, where the colonizers perpetrating genocide are white Europeans. This has sort of functioned as a blinder on how colonialism has functioned in the global South, so Asia, Africa, and how post-colonial states, like now called Iraq, have actually been colonized by Europeans. That's why we call them post-colonial states after they gained their so-called independence, but also how these have themselves act as colonial powers and model their occupation of Indigenous lands on the model of ethno-nationalist supremacy. It also misses how these Indigenous lands were given to these groups to make states in the so-called Middle East or Southwest Asia by European colonial powers. So my work then looks at the role European colonial powers have played in the dispossession of Assyrians from their homelands, of course, because it was at this time these borders were drawn and majority groups were given Assyrian land to make an Arab Iraq or an Arab Syria and a Turkish Turkey. But my work has also looked at how these states in the region are also colonial. History is long, and we need to think about the role of non-Western empires and conquerors, both in historical and contemporary times. The reason Assyrians are now a numerical minority on their traditional homelands and are treated as such, as opposed to being seen and treated as a sovereign nation, is because their homeland was conquered and settled by Arab, Persian, Turkish, and Kurdish peoples. Whenever we speak of invasion, conquest, colonialism, settlement, we need to remember that all of these processes are genocidal. The removal of indigenous inhabitants to build an Arab state or a nation, a Turkish state or a Kurdish state, is one aspect of genocide. We also need to remember that assimilation policies aimed at erasing Assyrian identity are also genocidal. These forms of genocide are ongoing because they're aimed at continuously attempting to erase Assyrian identity and absorb them into the majority identity. So a major preoccupation of my work looks at the Assyrian experience of dispossession and expulsion from their homelands in the making of modern states, an ongoing project for a greater Kurdistan in the region. The states that make up this region are carved out of ancient empires by colonial European powers. In their victory during the First World War, the French and the British divided this region with the Sykes-Picot Agreement. So in the making of these states by colonial powers, Assyrians became transnational, as Sargon already mentioned. They were divided across made-up borders of modern Iraq, Syria, Turkey, and Iran, countries whose territory is all located on the indigenous lands of Assyrians. And these are the kinds of questions and connections I'm interested in making in thinking about how colonialism, along with all the other intersecting structures I mentioned before, has operated across time, place, and space. It is these same colonial European powers that stole and enslaved millions of Africans as part of the Atlantic slave triangle, dispossessing, dislocating, and relocating African bodies to the Americas. This same process was the reason for invading, dispossessing, relocating indigenous nations in the Americas, assimilating and killing indigenous children in residential schools, dismantling indigenous ways of knowing, governing, and being, creating reserves and setting up states on this logic underpinned by ethno-nationalist white supremacy. This colonial story is not the story of Asian, African, and indigenous nations in the Americas. This colonial story disrupted. It didn't end, but it disrupted the story of Asian, African, and indigenous nations. This is the story of empires. It is the present-day legacy of colonialism. It is complicated and requires careful analysis and nuance. It is ongoing, both the story of empire and the story of those who have experienced, endured, and continue to survive empire. Calling us a minority today, without the context of genocide and dispossession, meant to specifically remove us from our land as a people and assimilating us so we can exist in Iraq, but without calling ourselves Assyrians, hides this historical and ongoing violence and focuses on the result that we number fewer, as if it was just a natural thing. But the thing is, the reason we are being dispossessed is because we are Assyrian. In its attempts to resist European colonialism, for example, Arab nationalism resulted in the erasure of non-Arabs, wiping out Assyrians and others. Kurdish nationalism, similarly, in its attempts to resist Arab nationalism, results in the attempted erasure of non-Kurds, including Assyrians. If you don't erase Assyrians, you can't make an Iraq or Iran or Turkey or Syria or Kurdistan built on the colonial model of ethno-nationalism. You can't claim this as your history as if this was just a natural evolution and progression of the people who lived on this land, and as if it was just the natural evolution of the land itself. There were very specific historical events, such as invasion, genocide, dispossession, and ongoing policies that led to our ethnic cleansing, assimilation, and dispossession that are necessary to make these states. So I think of Kim Tallberry here, who tells us that once we truly understand and accept that settlers actually lack the moral authority and sovereignty to own this land through theft, so the US, Canada, Iraq, Syria, Turkey, and Iran, and so on, claims on these lands are false. When we acknowledge this, we can also then acknowledge another fact. These countries debt for genocides committed against indigenous peoples and the appropriation of indigenous land and resources will never be repaid. Genocide, she says, cannot be undone. It cannot be undone by giving land back either, but giving land back is the only way we can begin to imagine and then enact decolonization. And finally, I will say that thinking about the connections between the indigenous experiences of colonization, Black bodies stolen and enslaved and brought over to the Americas, and the people of color whose migration is forced through violence, environmental disasters due to capitalist extraction, and colonial and imperial wars and conditions, these experiences and positionalities allow us to begin building relations of solidarity with each other. Solutions, if you will, and Serguns. The history of colonialism in the Americas started 500 years ago, and the story of colonialism in Mesopotamia started even earlier, but it is connected. When people are explaining what happened to them, it's the same. It's an issue of the land. We have been ripped from our land. We can find common ground in our experience of intergenerational trauma because of this dispossession, but also in our refusal to be erased, which is why we so stubbornly continue to call ourselves Assyrians. Because the Assyrian and other indigenous nation struggles, their continued existence reminds the world that colonialism and genocide is not final or complete. And maybe this is the place from which we can start to imagine another world where never again means never again for everyone now. So when you think about how intertwined these genocidal and colonial experiences are across the globe, it becomes quite clear which is the road to rebuild a better world that ensures our futures are better than our colonial genocidal present. Thank you.
Is it the one on the right or the left?
Hello. It's such a privilege to speak on this panel because usually you have to devote a good portion of your talk to explaining what Assyrians are and the current issues we face. And so that Sargon and Mariam did that for me is a real privilege. So I can just talk about the art. You're good. That's it, for sure. Yep. It's also such a privilege because so much of the work I do is has been beautifully explained and excavated by these two. And then that gives me ideas for how to dumb it down a little bit. So today I'll be speaking about give a brief overview of research into incantation bowls and how they were used by Assyrians. Yes, here we go. How that translates into a fine arts practice, the making of objects and art, and how that research created the practice of making my own bowls, as well as community projects surrounding that. And so I'll be also speaking about the project Native Soil. So I have been doing research on Mesopotamian incantation bowls, how Assyrians used them, and kind of used that research to start the Assyrian prayer bowl archive, which uses incantation bowls as a basis for revitalizing ancient Assyrian tradition and try and bring that tradition into a contemporary context. So what are incantation bowls? Here's a couple pictures of some old ones that were dug up. They're called, in scholarly research, incantation or magic bowls. And the practice of writing prayers for physical healing and spiritual protection on bowls dates back to at least the 2nd century in Assyrian, Jewish, and Mandaic communities. Clay bowls were made by artisans and given to priests who would consult a codex of prescriptive prayers that called on the names of God and mentioned important biblical figures that usually related to the illness or injury of the person using the bowl. And so one of the more interesting ones is if you had a back injury, they would call upon the name of King Solomon, who, as we all know, injured his back building the temple. And so they had their own world associated with them. Many of the bowls, oh, and this is like a example of what the codex looked like. Many of the bowls have been taken from their land, dug up, and translated, revealing that the common prayers of the day were for safe childbirth, which made up the huge majority of bowls, protection from wild animals, and the other big one was spiritual protection from demons or demonic forces that might try and enter your home. Many bowls were found buried upside down outside of front doors of dwellings, with the belief that the power of the words of the prayer would entrap any dark spiritual force that tried to enter the home. And then there were other rituals associated with these bowls. So sometimes you would burn incense in the bowl, or you would pour water in it and let the water soak up the power of the words. And then you drink the water, or you'd put spices in the water, or you would put bowls in like the 4 corners of your house. So those were some of those. And then kind of an exciting part. So a huge part of this was really, really popular to study in like the 20s and 30s when they were digging these up and translating them. And so a bunch of bowls were found that just had scribbles on them. It wasn't a real language. And so they called these fake bowls, which is because like the whole point of bringing the bowls back was to translate them, you know. And so if it's not translatable, it must not be real. And so a scholar kind of talks about this and instead interprets it that the scribbles pointed to a belief in the written word as powerful, that it didn't even need to be translatable in order to be powerful. Simply the act of writing could conjure healing and protection. And in a society that was illiterate, makes sense to me. So when we talk about revitalizing the practice of incantation bowls, which is, you know, not the original word for them, we have to talk about revitalization because when missionaries came into the region, into Assyrian regions specifically, in the late 1800s, early 1900s, they observed that this practice was ongoing. a lot of the research done into these bowls places it in a very ancient context and likes to believe that they died out by the 5th century, but it didn't. And we know that because missionaries saw them being made and immediately squashed the practice. And they were like, hello, we're here to bring Christianity to you Christians in the region. And that is not what we do. That is not Christianity. That is sorcery. And they were super, super afraid that they were making love charms so that people were coming to priests to get someone to fall in love with them. And that was clearly ungodly and not good. And so it became really taboo, and the practice had to become either very secret or die out altogether. And so many Assyrians today either don't know about the practice, or when they hear about it, they're like, oh yeah, those are the magic bowls, no good. Yeah. And we don't do that anymore. And unless you need one, then I can tell you who to get one from. But it's only if things are really dire, you know. So when I, you know, found out about this practice that I hadn't heard about and didn't know about, I wanted to create something that referenced this history of ours and but remixes it in some way. So the Assyrian Pueblo Archive started. This is the website. And what I was looking for was to create a kind of time capsule that could collect information about who we are through our prayers and oral histories, just as older incantation bowls showed who the people were at the time through their prayers and fears and kind of what they were facing. This project also gives agency back into the hands of my people to express our histories as we experience them, as we see fit, and most importantly, express those histories on objects that are culturally relevant to us. So instead of laptop and website, a bowl that actually relates to us. My research culminated in the beginning of the Assyrian Pueblo Archive, and this is the archive page of the website. And it collects sacred words and audio recordings of living Assyrians. So I ask people to submit something to the project and record themselves speaking it. I've been doing workshops within the Assyrian community, traveling both in the US and abroad to get a comprehensive idea of where Assyrians live in the world, what languages we've been forced to learn and express our Assyrian identity in, the breadth of hopes and fears that live within us. And this is an ongoing process, so I am continuing to collect prayers at least for the next year, write them on bowls, and use the audio recordings hopefully for an exhibition that shows both the physical words of our nation and people of our nation, with the bowls kind of functioning as our mouths, as well as the audible, you know, part of our nation of all the languages we speak that kind of reflect where we're at in the world. And so that's kind of the goals, once again, of this project, to educate Assyrians about our spiritual and ritual and forgotten objects, remix the practice so that we can engage with this history without trying to recreate it exactly, seeing as I'm not a priest and don't have the codex, and yet, you know, take inspiration from it and say these are sacred words, the poems, the oral histories, the prayers that we have for our people, that this is sacred, this is what keeps us going, and this can create power in the same way that the ancient bowls did. I'm also documenting our movement throughout the world and the languages we now speak as well, specifically as the different dialects that we speak, because it's all over the place, and the different ways that each Assyrian writes our language, because that changes drastically from Assyrian to Assyrian. And so there's an exhibit up right now at the Innovation Gallery, and it's up until tomorrow. And so these are a couple of the bowls that I've been making. Well, there we go. There we go. So this is a picture of this guy, Mr. Cruz, harvesting clay, which is important because this project was inspired by his class while I was at the University of New Mexico, where he teaches. He said, "How does your culture use clay?" And so I had to find out. I didn't know. And I found out that we made bowls and wrote sacred prayers on them. And so it was really great taking his class, which is called Pueblo Pottery, because I had taken clay classes before, but they never really captured me. But once I took a class where clay becomes a discussion about land, I was very interested and very hooked. And in his class, we go out into the field first day to places passed down to him in order to harvest natural clay. In the tradition of his people, we pray over the land, give the land an offering, take from the land, then make another offering while praying a prayer of healing. By starting the course in this way, we immediately became aware of the conversation around land and therefore land ownership. As Assyrians, we can immediately understand the deep implications that harvesting clay from land has. I felt it in my body and spirit immediately, and the process of making then becomes even more intentional and important. And I would never use the land lightly that Mr. Cruz gave us very specific access to. He gave us a gift that inspired me and made me want to be generous in turn. So I said, "Hey, Mr. Cruz, do you want to go to Iraq with me?" So that's so generous. Because right after taking his class, I went to northern Iraq for the first time and was able to immediately see that that whole land is covered in natural clay. And that was Indigenous knowledge that was passed on to me that I could then recognize in my own Indigenous homeland, which was a huge gift. So we took the idea of trans-Indigenous exchange one step further. So I was making bowls. Sorry, I forgot to talk about this. I was making bowls in the Pueblo coil method that Mr. Cruz also passed on. And so the bowls that I was making for the prayer bowl archive became then also associated with the land that I was making them on. And so after that, we planned a trip to the village of Bebede in northern Iraq, where we would hold clay making workshops. And this took place last June, and it was I brought along Professor Cruz and a classmate and Navajo potter, Jared So. And so now I'm going to show you my vacation slides from that. We started by visiting a pottery family, one of the few remaining in the region, headed by Mam Ishu, originally from Dirigny, which is a village famous for pottery. He was a wealth of information, and Professor Cruz and Jared So exchanged information at length about methods of harvesting and working with natural clay through our wonderful translator, Shibla Betchmule. And it was a really important part of the trip connecting with him, not only because he was the knowledge keeper of clay harvesting and making practices within our Indigenous homeland, but also because it was so, I don't know, heartbreaking to hear that Dirigny, this clay village, he was forcibly kicked out of. He had to leave and therefore had lost access to a lot of the harvesting sites for very specific types of clay and making. And so now he makes a different kind of vessel on the wheel in the village that he's in now, with a very different type of clay that has a very different type of application. And so the clay from his home village and that has kind of been passed down throughout generations was cookware. You could use it for cookware, and this clay you cannot. And so that became a really important discussion about access to land and how that affects our cultural and art practices. This is his firing site, which was really exciting because Mr. Cruz taught us to fire using fire. And you can obviously get really high tech with clay, but fire is fire. And so this was kind of one of multiple kilns that he's built throughout the region as his family has had to move around. And his workshop. And they're just, she was a powerhouse of, she had a big stick she would pound the clay with, because it comes in like a rocky form at first, and you have to pound it down to a very fine powder. And she had been doing it for a long time, you could tell. Truly. And so we exchanged a lot of information on how our different cultural practices intersect. We held 7 days of workshops for locals, which there were a lot of young people there, which was great. And they were shown what natural clay looks like from Mamishu and his family, how to reduce it down to a fine powder with some bricks that we found laying around, and then add water and knead it until it becomes workable clay. And around 20 to 40 participants came each day of the workshops. And each day kind of passed with increasing familiarity with each other and the medium, and cups started to form, teapots, ashtrays, plates, figures, beads, and tablets with the Assyrian language carved into them. Guest artists came by and spoke about their art practices and demonstrated how to hand build, the process of Assyrian calligraphy, and gave demonstrations of making vessels on the wheel. Oh, well, there's that. Yeah, calligraphy, wheel. And people of all ages watched and clapped and asked questions and got inspiration for their own artistic pieces they were making. And there we go. More importantly, documented for themselves what was going on to create their own archive of Assyrian culture. And it was really beautiful to see everyone pulling out their phone, documenting their culture themselves, which is something we're very used to doing. So, biggest takeaways from these two projects and how they intersect the Assyrian Pueblo Archive and native soil is that, and my work with Mr. Cruz and being in New Mexico, which is home to a large group of Indigenous people. Both of our communities have been tasked with documenting and preserving our own histories and cultures, not being able to trust others to do it for us. We found they do a bad job. Both of us have experienced political regimes actively erasing our cultures, oppressing our language and cultural identity. We've both faced displacement. We've both faced enacting our cultures in secret or in foreign places. And we've both been tasked to rebuild, and as we attempt to do that, to fill in large gaps. I believe we can look to each other for pathways to rebuilding. And native soil was rooted in that concept that we're stronger in solidarity and we can offer each other gifts on how to rebuild because our communities have gone through such similarities. And personally, what better way to talk about rebuilding than to work around a table with clay, literal pieces of the land, making art out of that land. And there's something that happens when you're working with clay. When your hands are busy, your mind is clear, and a conversation can happen in a really natural way. And I'll give you a couple more pictures as I say this. Okay. The natural kinship between our communities was felt, was embodied, and bridges were built culturally between us and our two representatives from Indigenous tribes within the US, and gave both of our communities hope for the future of craft, of art, and of our nations. What both the Assyrian Prayer Bowl Archive and Native Soil as projects does is expresses a hope and plan for the future of Assyrians. It paves the way for solidarity with groups that are akin to us. It puts cultural exchange as a future pathway, a way to push our traditional art and culture forward. And for me, instead of focusing on loss, it creates the opportunity to ask questions on how to reimagine and redeem specific parts of our identity and culture. Thank you.
Thank you for having us here today. It's been a very interesting couple of days for me, trying to catch up with sleep. But a lot to see, very different here, temperature-wise. Not used to the heat like I used to be, and just getting old, I guess. Used to the cold. Sinus is a problem for me here. Like probably many of you here. But thank you for inviting us, and also for Esther being reaching out to having me be part of this beautiful conversation that we all face in many different ways and our different cultures. But working with the community in Baverde with the Assyrians, we are all connected in one way or another, but have the same hopes and dreams as well, and face the many different crises that come from power grabbing, wanting to be the only individual to own such property, as they call it, but it doesn't belong to anyone. It does not. It belongs to all of us. And we're all connected in one way or another. And we are all but the reflection of who she is, meaning Mother Earth. In our language, as we create, we call her Being Wheel, which means Mother Clay. She's something that she offers us to instill our beliefs as well as our well-being, who we are and where we tend to be. How do we become an individual, a power within our own self to move forward and open up the eyes and arms of people as well, but also to grasp the same knowledge we all seek. We all have a government within our own communities, from as Indigenous people, from where we all come from. If they only understood. With my community being Pueblo, when conquistadors came into our area, they didn't understand the structure of what we had. We had a government in place, but it wasn't a type of government they understood. We had a religion. We had our prayers. We had a being. And that being also has many names in many cultures, but is one being. And is a reflection of everything that is on the earth itself. When we create our pots, as Esther had stated earlier, we approach the material with honor and respect. Think of yourself as you're wandering about, you you bump into a rock or unsteady path, you fall down, you scrape your knee or you cut yourself. Basically, we're doing the same to the earth itself. We're opening a wound. But before we do that, we state our intentions with a prayer. And then when we open that wound, we gather only what we need. But man tends to forget they take more than what they need. They forget about everybody else. So when we gather the material for the purpose we want, we also ask for guidance and permission. And so once we do put our hand on the material, you become the guardian of that material. It's just like your child being born. That is your child now. What do you do when your child is born? You welcome it, you bathe it, you make a bed. Lie your child down. Same thing happens with the clay. And when we're building our clay pots, we take it through those various stages of growth, just like your brothers, your sisters, your nephews, from childhood to adolescent to adult. That's the way we see it in the traditional way of building. And as we grow and go through the different stages, your pot is getting all these characteristics as well, meaning the sanding, the water washing, the slipping, the polishing, and the painting. You're giving it identity. And the birth of your pot is through that ring of fire that women talk about when they give birth to your child. Same thing. It comes through that ring of fire, through the outside firing. Your child is born, meaning your pot. So a lot of our pots aren't just for looks. You know, we all play a function, just like every one of us. Your being houses something, and so does that pot. As we were taught and still are reminded that we are but the reflection of the pot itself. We house something, we mean something, we play a function.